Chapter 66, The Shark Massacre. When the Southern fishery captured a sperm whale after long and weary toil, is brought alongside late at night. It is not, as a general thing at least, customary to proceed at once to the business of cutting him in. For that business is an exceedingly laborious one. It is not very soon completed and requires all hands to set about it. Therefore, the common usage is to take in all sail, lash the helm a-lee, and then send every one below to his hammock till daylight, with the reservation that until that time, anchor watches shall be kept. That is, 2 and 2 for an hour. Each couple, the crew in rotation, shall mount the deck to see that all goes well. But sometimes, especially upon the line in the Pacific, this plan will not answer at all, because such incalculable hosts of shark gather round the moored carcass that were he left for 6 hours, say, on a stretch, little more of a skeleton would be visible by morning. In most parts of the ocean, however, where these fish do not largely abound, their wondrous voracity can at times considerably diminish by vigorously stirring them up with sharp whaling spades, a procedure notwithstanding which in some instances only seems to tickle them into still greater activity. But it was not thus in the present case with the Pequod's sharks, though to be sure, any man unaccustomed to such sights to have looked over his side that night would have almost thought the whole round sea was one huge cheese, and those sharks the maggots in it.
Nevertheless, upon Stubbs setting the anchor watch after his supper was concluded, and when, accordingly, Queequeg and the forecastle seamen came on deck, no small excitement was created among the sharks. For immediately suspending the cutting stages over the side and lowering 3 lanterns so that they cast long gleams of light over the turbid sea, these 2 mariners, darting their long whaling spades, kept up on an insistent murdering of the sharks by striking the keen steel deep into their skulls, seemingly their only vital part. But in the foamy confusion of their mixed and struggling hosts, the marksmen could not always hit their marks, and this brought out new revelations of the incredible ferocity of the foe. They viciously snapped not only at each other's disembowelments, but, like flexible bows, bent round and bit their own, till those entrails seemed swallowed over and over again by the same mouth, to be oppositely voided by the gaping wound. Nor was this all. It was unsafe to meddle with the corpses and ghosts of these creatures. A sort of generic or panaceic vitality seemed to lurk in their very joints and bones. After what might be called the individual life had departed, killed and hoisted on deck for the sake of his skin, one of these sharks almost took poor Queequeg's hand off when he tried to shut down the dead lid of his murderous jaw. Queequeg no care what God made him, shark, said the savage, antagonizingly lifting up his hand and down. Whether free Joe God or Nantucket God, but to God what made the shark must be one damn Ingun. 67. Cutting in. It was a Saturday night, and such a Sabbath as followed. Ex officio professors of Sabbath breaking are all whalemen. The Ivy Pequod was turned to what seemed a shamble, every sailor a butcher. You would have thought we were offering up 10,000 red oxen to the sea gods. In the first place, the enormous cutting tackle, among the other ponderous things comprising of a clutter of blocks, generally painted green, and with no single man can possibly lift. This vast bunch of grapes was swayed to the maintop and firmly lashed to the lower masthead, the strongest point anywhere above the ship's deck. The end of the hawser-like rope winding through these intricacies was then conducted to the windlass, and the huge lower block of the tackle was swung over the whale. To this block, the great blubber hook, weighing some 100 pounds, was attached. And now, suspended in stages over the side, Starbuck and Stubb, the mates, armed with their long spades, began cutting a hole in the body for the insertion of the hook just above the nearest of the two side fins. This done, a broad semicircular line cut round the hole, the hook is inserted, and the main body of the crew, striking up a wild chorus, now commence heaving in one dense crowd at the windlass, when instantly the entire ship careens over on her side. Every bolt in her starts like the nail head of an old house in frosty weather. She trembles, quivers, and nods her frigid mastheads to the sky. More and more she leans over the whale, while every gasping heave of the windlass is answered by a heaping heave from the billows, till at last a swift, startling snap is heard. With the great swish of the ship rolls upwards and backwards from the whale, and the triumphant tackle rises into sight, dragging after it the disengaged semicircular end of the first strip of blubber. Now, as the blubber envelops the whale, precisely as the rind does an orange, so it is stripped from the body precisely as an orange is sometimes stripped by spiralizing it. For the strain constantly kept up by the windlass continually keeps the whale rolling over and over in the water, and the blubber in one strip uniformly peels off along the line called the scarf. Simultaneously cut by the spades of Starbuck and Stubb, the mates, and just as fast in this thus peeled off. And indeed, by that very act itself, it is all the time being hoisted higher and higher aloft till the upper end grazes the maintop, and the men at the windlass then cease heaving for a moment or two. The prodigious blood-dripping mass sways to and fro as if let down from the sky, and everyone present must take a good heed to dodge it when it swings, else it may box his ears and pitch him headlong overboard. One of the attending harpooners now advanced with long, keen weapon, called a boarding sword, and watched his chance as he dexterously slices out a considerable hole in the lower part of the swinging mass. Into this hole, the end of the second alternating great tackle is then hooked as to retain a hold upon the blubber, in order to prepare for what follows. Whereupon, this accomplished swordsman, warning all hands to stand off, once more makes a scientific dash at the mass, and with a few sidelong, desperate lunging, slicing, severs it completely in twain. And so, when the short lower part is still fast, the long upper strip, called a blanket piece, swings clear and is ready for lowering. The heavers forward now resume their song, and when one tackle is peeling and hoisting the second strip from the whale, the other is slowly slackened away, and down goes the first strip through the main hatchway right beneath, into an unfurnished parlor called the blubber room. Into this twilight apartment, sundry nimble hands coil along the long blanket piece as if it were a great live mass of plaited serpents. And thus the work proceeds, two tackles hoisting and lowering simultaneously, both whale and windlass heaving, the heavers singing, the blubber room gentlemen coiling, the mates scarfing, the ship straining, and all hands swearing occasionally by way of again the general friction. 68. The blanket. I have given no small attention to that now unvexed subject, the skin of the whale. I have controversies about it, which experiment whalemen afloat and learned naturalists ashore. My original opinion remains unchanged, but is only an opinion. The question is, what and where is the skin of the whale? Already you know what blubber is. The blubber is something of the consistence of firm, close-grained beef, but tougher, more elastic and compact, and ranges from 8 to 10 to 12 and 15 inches in thickness. Now, however, preposterous it may at first seem to talk of any creature's skin as being of that sort of consistence and thickness, yet in point of fact, there is no argument against such presumption, because you cannot raise any other dense enveloping layer from the whale's body but the same blubber, and the outermost enveloping layer of any animal, reasonably dense, what can that be called but the skin? True, from the unmarred dead body of the whale, you may scrape off with your hand an infinitely thin, transparent substance, somewhat resembling the thinnest shreds of isinglass, only it is almost as flexible and soft as satin. That is, previous to being dried, when it not only contracts and thickens, but becomes rather hard and brittle. I have several such dried bits, in which I use for marks in my whale books. It is transparent, as I said before, and being laid upon the printed page, I have sometimes pleased myself with fancying external magnifying influence. At any rate, it is pleasant to read about whales through their own spectacles, as you may say. But I am driving at here is this, that same infinitely thin isinglass substance, which, I admit, invests the entire body of the whale, is not so much to be regarded as the skin of the creature as the skin of the skin, so to speak. For we were simply ridiculous to say that the proper skin of a tremendous whale is thinner and more tender than any skin of a newborn child. But no more of this. Assuming... Oh, well, yeah. Perfect time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for saying it out loud. I very much appreciate it. Um, Great. So, assuming the blubber to be the skin of the whale, then when this skin, as in the case of a very large sperm whale, will yield the bulk of 100 barrels of oil. And when it is considered that, in quantity, or rather weight, that oil, in its express state, is only 3/4 and not the entire substance of the coat, some idea may hence be had of the enormousness of that animated mass, a mere part of whose mere integument yields such a lake of liquid as that. Reckoning 10 barrels to the ton, you have 10 barrels for the net weight of only 3/4 of the stuff of the whale's skin. In life, the visible surface of the sperm whale is not the least among the marvels he presents. Most invariably, it is all over obliquely crossed and recrossed with numberless straight marks in thick array, sometimes like those in the finest Italian line engravings. But these marks do not seem to be impressed upon the isinglass substance above mentioned, but seem to be seen through it, as if they were engraved upon the body itself. Nor is this all. In some instances, to the quick, observant eye, those linear marks, as it is veritable engraving, but afford the ground for any other delineations. These are hieroglyphical. That is, if you call those mysterious ciphers on the walls of pyramids hieroglyphs, then that is the proper word to use in the present context. By my retentive memory of the hieroglyphics, once upon a sperm whale in particular, I was much struck with the plate representing the old Indian characters chiseled on the famous hieroglyphic palisades on the banks of the upper Mississippi. Like those mystic rocks, too, the mystic marked whale remains undecipherable. This allusion to the Indian rocks reminds me of another thing. Besides all the phenomena with the exterior the sperm whale presents, he not seldom displays the back, and more especially his flanks, effacing in great part of the regular linear appearance by reason of numerous rude scratches, although of an irregular, random aspect. I should say that those New England rocks on the sea coast, which which Agassiz imagines to bear the marks of violent scraping contact with vast floating icebergs, I should say that those rocks must not a little resemble the sperm whale in this particular. It also seems to me that such scratches in the whale were probably made by hostile contact with other whales, for I have most remarked them in large, full-grown bulls of the species. A word or two more concerning this matter of the skin or the blubber of the whale. It's already been said that this is the strip of him, that it is the strip of him in long pieces called blanket pieces. Like most sea terms, this one is very happy and significant, for the whale is indeed wrapped up in his blubber in a very real blanket or counterpane, or still better, an Indian poncho slipped over his head and skirted his extremity. And by this reason of this cozy blanketing of his body, and that whale is enabled to keep himself comfortable in all weathers and all seas, times and tides. What would become of a Greenland whale, say, in those shuddering icy seas in the north, if unsupplied with his cozy stirrup? True, other fish are found exceedingly brisk in those waters, whose very bellies are refrigerators, creatures that warm themselves under the lee of an iceberg, as a traveler in winter would bask before an inn fire. Whereas like man, the whale has lungs and warm blood, freezes blood, and he dies. How wonderful is it then, except after explanation, that this great monster, to whom corporeal warmth is as indispensable to it as man, how wonderful that he should be found at home, immersed to his lips for life in those Arctic waters, where, when seamen fall overboard, they are sometimes found, months afterwards, perpendicularly frozen to the hearts of fields of ice, as a fly is found glued in amber. But more surprising it is to know, as it has been proved by experiment, that the blood of a polar whale is warmer than that of a Borneo in summer. It does not seem to me that herein we see the rare virtue of a strong individual vitality, and the rare virtue of thick walls, and the rare virtue of interior spaciousness. O man, admire and model thyself after the whale. Do thou, too, remain warm among ice. Do thou, too, live in this world without being of it. Be cool at the equator, keep thy blood fluid at the pole. Like the great dome of St. Peter's, and like the great whale, retain, O man, and all seasons a temperature of thine own. But how easy and how hopeless to teach these fine things. Of erections, how few are domed like St. Peter's. Of creatures, how few vast as the whale. Chapter 69, The Funeral. Haul in the chains, let the carcass go astern. The vast tackles have now done their duty. The peeled white body of the beheaded whale flashes like a marble sepulchre, although changed in hue, as it has not perceptibly lost any in bulk. It is still colossal. Slowly it floats more and more away, the water around it torn and splashed by the insatiate sharks, and the air above vexed with rapacious flights of screaming fowls, whose beaks are so insulting carnards into the whale. A vast white headless phantom floats further and further from the ship, and every rod that it so floats, which so seems roods of sharks and cubic roods of fowls, augment the murderous din. For hours and hours from the almost stationary ship that hideous sight is seen. Beneath the unclouded and mild azure sky, upon the fair face of the pleasant sea, wafted by the joyous breezes, the great mass of death floats on, till lost in infinite perspectives. There's a most doleful and mocking funeral. The sea vultures and all pious mourning and air sharks will punctiliously in black and speckled. In life, but few of them would have helped the whale, I ween, if peradventure he had needed it. But upon the banquet of his funeral, they most piously do bounce. O horrible vulturism of earth, for which does not the mightiest whale is free. Nor is this the end. Desecrated as the body is, a vengeful ghost survives and hovers over it to scare. Espied by some timid man of war or blundering discover vessel from afar, when the distance obscuring the swarming fowls, nevertheless still shows the white mass floating in the sun, and the white spray heaving high against it. Straightway the whale's unharming corpse, and the trembling fingers is set down to the log, shoals, rocks, and breakers hereabouts. Beware! And for years afterwards, perhaps, ships shunned the place, leaping over it as silly sheep leap over the vacuum, because their leader originally leapt when there was a stick he held. There's your law of precedence. There's your utility of traditions. There's the story of your obstinate survival in old beliefs never bottomed on the earth, and now not even hovering in the air. There's orthodoxy. Thus, while in life, the great whale's body may have been a real terror to his foes, in his death, his ghost becomes a powerful panic to a world. Are you a believer in ghosts, my friend? There are other ghosts than the Cock Lane one, and further and far deeper men than Dr. Johnson who's believed in them. Chapter 70, The Sphinx. It should not have been omitted that previous to completely stripping the body of the Leviathan, he was beheaded. Now, the beheading of a sperm whale is a scientific anatomical feat upon which experienced whale surgeons very much pride themselves, and not without reason. Consider that the whale has nothing that can be properly called a neck. On the contrary, where his head and his body seem to join, there is, in that very place, the thickest part of him. Remember also that the surgeon must operate from above, some 8 or 10 feet intervening between him and his subject, and that the subject, almost hidden in a discolored, rolling, oftentimes tumultuous and bursting sea. Bear in mind, too, that under these untoward circumstances, he has to cut many feet deep into the flesh, and in that subterraneous manner, without so much as getting one single peep into the ever-contracting gash thus made. He must skillfully steer clear of all adjacent interdicted parts, and exactly divide the spine at a critical point hard by its insertion into the skull. Do you not marvel, then, at Stubbs' boast that he demanded but 10 minutes to behead a sperm whale?
When first severed, the head is dropped astern and held there by a cable till the body is stripped. That done, if it belonged to a small whale, it is hoisted on deck to be deliberately disposed of. But with a full-grown Leviathan, this is impossible, for the sperm whale's head embraces nearly 1/3 of his bulk, and completely to suspend such a burden as that, even by the immense tackles of a whaler, this were as vain a thing to attempt as weighing a Dutch barn in jeweler's scales. The Pequod's whale being decapitated and the body stripped, the head was hoisted against the ship's side, about halfway out of the sea, so that it might yet in great part be buoyed up by its native element. And there, with the strained craft steeply leaning over to it, by reason of the enormous downward drag from the lower masthead, and every yard arm on that side projecting like a crane over the waves, there that blood-dripping head hung to the Pequod's waist like the giant Holofernes from the girdle of Judith. When this last task was accomplished, it was noon, and the seamen went below to their dinner. Silence reigned over the before tumultuous, but now deserted deck. An intense copper calm, like a universal yellow lotus, was more and more unfolding its noiseless, measureless leaves upon the sea. A short space elapsed, and up into this noiselessness came Ahab alone from his cabin. Taking a few turns on the quarterdeck, he paused to gaze over the side, then slowly getting into the main chains, he took Stubbs' long spade, still remaining there after the whale's decapitation, and striking it into the lower part of the half-suspended mass, placed its other end crutchwise under one arm, and so stood leaning over with eyes attentively fixed on this head. It was a black and hooded head, and hanging there in the midst of so intense a calm, it seemed the sphinxes in the desert. "Speak, thou vast and venerable head," muttered Ahab, "which, though ungarnished with a beard, yet here and there lookest hoary with mosses. Speak, miny head, and tell us the secret thing that is in thee. Of all divers, thou hast dived the deepest. That head upon which the upper sun now gleams has moved amid this world's foundations. Where unrecorded names and navies rust, and untold hopes and anchors rot, where in her murderous hold this frigate earth is ballast with bones of millions of the drowned, there, in that awful waterland, there was thy most familiar home. Thou hast been where belle or diver never went, hast slept by many a sailor's side, where sleepless mothers would give their lives to lay them down. Thou saw'st the locked lovers when leaping from their flaming ship, heart to heart they sank beneath the exulting wave, true to each other when heaven seemed false to them. Thou saw'st the murdered mate when tossed by pirates from the midnight deck. For hours he fell into the deeper midnight of the insatiate maw, and his murderers still sailed on unharmed, while swift lightnings shivered the neighboring ship that would have borne a righteous husband to outstretched longing arms. O head, thou hast seen enough to split the planets and make an infidel of Abraham, and not one syllable is thine. Sail ho, cried a triumphant voice from the main masthead. I? Well, now that's cheering, cried Ahab, suddenly erecting himself, while whole thunderclouds swept aside from his brow. That lively cry upon this deadly calm might almost convert a better man. Where away? 3 points on the starboard bow, sir, and bringing down our breeze to us. Better and better, man. Would now St. Paul would come along that way, and to my breezelessness bring his breeze. O nature and O soul of man, how far beyond all utterance are your linked analogies. Not the smallest atom stirs or lives on matter, but has its cunning duplicate in mind. Chapter 71, the Jeroboam story. Hand in hand, breeze and ship blew on, but the breeze came faster than the ship, and soon the Pequod began to rock. By and by, through the glass, the strangers' boats and manned mastheads proved her a whaling ship. But as she was so far to windward and shooting by, apparently making a passage to some other ground, the Pequod could not hope to reach her. So the signal was set to see what response would be made. Here be it said that, like the vessels of military marines, the ships of the American whale fleet have each a private signal, all which signals being collected in a book with the names of the respective vessels attached. Every captain is provided with it, whereby the whale commanders are enabled to recognize each other upon the ocean, even at considerable distances, and with no small facility. The Pequod's signal was at last responded to by the strangers setting her own, which proved the ship to be the Jeroboam of Nantucket. Squaring her yards, she bore down, ranged a beam under the Pequod's lee, and lowered a boat. It soon drew nigh, but as the side ladder was being rigged by Starbuck's order to accompany the visiting captain, the stranger in question waved his hand from his boat's stern in token of that proceeding being entirely unnecessary. It turned out that the Jeroboam had a malignant epidemic on board, and that Mayhew, her captain, was fearful of infecting the Pequod's company. For though himself and the boat's crew remained untainted, and though his ship was half a rifle shot off, and an incorruptible sea in air rolling and flowing between, yet conscientiously adhering to the timid quarantine of the land, he peremptorily refused to come into direct contact with the Pequod. But this did by no means prevent all communication. Preserving an interval of some few yards between itself and the ship, the Jeroboam's boat, by the occasional use of its oars, contrived to keep parallel to the Pequod. and as she heavily forged through the sea, for by this time it blew very fresh, and with her main topsail aback, though indeed at times by the sudden onset of a large rolling wave, the boat would be pushed some way ahead, but it would soon be skillfully brought to her proper bearings again. Subject to this and other the like interruptions now and then, a conversation was sustained between the two parties, but at intervals not without still another interruption of a very different sort. Pulling an oar in the Jeroboam's boat was a man of singular appearance. Even in that wild whaling life where individual notabilities make up all totalities, he was a small, short, youngish man, sprinkled all over his face with freckles and wearing redundant yellow hair. A long-skirted, cabalistically cut coat of a faded walnut tinge enveloped him, the overlapping sleeves of which were rolled up to his wrists. A deep, settled, fanatic delirium was in his eyes. So soon as this figure had been first descried, Stubb had exclaimed, "That's he! That's he! The long-togged scaramouche the town hose company told us of." Stubb here alluded to a strange story told of the Jeroboam and a certain man among her crew some time previous when the Pequod spoke of the town hoe. According to this account, and what was subsequently learned, it seemed that the scaramouche in question had gained a wonderful ascendancy over almost everybody in the Jeroboam. His story was this. He had been originally nurtured among the crazy society of Nesciuna Shakers, where he had been a great prophet. In their cracked, secret meetings, having several times descended from heaven by way of a trap door, announcing the speedy opening of the seventh vial, which he carried in his vest pocket, but which, instead of containing gunpowder, was supposed to be charged with laudanum. A strange apostolic whim having seized him, he had left Nesciuna for Nantucket, where, with that cunning peculiar to craziness, he assumed a steady, common-sense exterior and offered himself as a green hand candidate for the Jeroboam's whaling voyage. They engaged him, but straightway upon the ship's getting out of sight of land, his insanity broke out in a freshet. He announced himself as the Archangel Gabriel and commanded the captain to jump aboard. He published his manifesto, whereby he set forth himself as the deliverer of the Isles of the Sea and vicar general of all Oceanica. The unflinching earnestness with which he declared these things, the dark, daring play of his sleepless, excited imagination, and all the preternatural terrors of real delirium, united to invest this Gabriel in the minds of the majority of the ignorant crew with an atmosphere of sacredness.
Moreover, they were afraid of him. As such a man, however, was not of much practical use in the ship, especially as he refused to work except when he pleased, the incredulous captain would fain have been rid of him, but apprised that individual's attention was to land him in the first convenient port, the archangel forthwith opened all his seals and vials, devoting the ship and all hands to unconditional perdition. In this case, this intention was carried out. So strongly did he work upon his disciples among the crew that at last, in a body, they went to the captain and told him if Gabriel was sent from the ship, not a man of them would remain. He was therefore forced to relinquish his plan. Nor would they permit Gabriel to be in any way maltreated, say or do what he would. So that it came to pass that Gabriel had the complete freedom of the ship. The consequence of all this was that the archangel cared little or nothing for the captain and mates, and since the epidemic had broken out, he carried a higher hand than ever, declaring that the plague, as he called it, was at his sole command, nor should it be stayed but according to his good pleasure. The sailors, mostly poor devils, cringed, and some of them fawned before him in obedience to his instructions, sometimes rendering him personal homage as to a god. Such things may seem incredible, but however wondrous, they are true. Nor is the history of fanatics half so striking in respect to the measureless self-deception of the fanatic himself, as his measureless power of deceiving and bedeviling so many others. But it is time to return to the Pequod. "I fear not thy epidemic, man," said Ahab from the bulwarks to Captain Mayhew, who stood in the boat stern. "Come on board." But now Gabriel started to his feet. Think of the fevers, yellow and bilious. Beware of the horrible plague." "Gabriel, Gabriel," cried Captain Mayhew, "thou must either—" But that instant a headlong wave shot the boat far ahead, and its seethings drowned all speech. "Hast thou seen the white whale?" demanded Ahab, when the boat drifted back. Think of thy whaleboat, stoven and sunk. Beware the horrible tale." "I tell thee again, Gabriel, that—" But again the boat tore ahead, as if dragged by fiends. Nothing was said for some moments, while a succession of riotous waves rolled by, which by one of these occasional caprices of the seas were tumbling, not heaving it. Meantime, the hoisted sperm whale's head jogged about very violently, and Gabriel was seen eyeing it with rather more apprehensiveness than his archangel nature seemed to warrant. When this interlude was over, Captain Mayhew began a dark story concerning Moby-Dick, not, however, without frequent interruptions from Gabriel, whenever his name was mentioned, and the crazy sea that seemed leagued with him. It seemed that the Jeroboam had not long left home when, upon speaking a whale ship, her people were reliably apprised of the existence of Moby-Dick and the havoc he had made. Greedily sucking in this intelligence, Gabriel solemnly warned the captain against attacking the white whale in case the monster should be seen. In his gibbering insanity, pronouncing the white whale to be no less as being the Shaker god incarnated, the Shakers receiving the Bible. But when, some year or two afterwards, Moby-Dick was fairly sighted from the mastheads, Macy, the chief mate, burned with ardor to encounter him, and the captain himself being not unwilling to let him have the opportunity, despite all the archangel's denunciations and forewarnings, Macy succeeded in persuading 5 men to man his boat. With them, he pushed off, and after much weary pulling and many perilous, unsuccessful onsets, he at last succeeded in getting one iron fast. Meantime, Gabriel, ascending to the main royal masthead, was tossing one arm in frantic gestures and hurling forth prophecies of speedy doom to the sacrilegious assailants of his divinity. Now, while Macy, the mate, was standing up in his boat's bow, and with all the reckless energy of his tribe was venting his wild exclamations upon the whale, and essaying to get a fair chance for his poised lance, lo, a broad white shadow rose from the sea, by its quick fanning motion, temporarily taking the breath out of the bodies of the oarsmen. Next instant, the luckless mate, so full of furious life, was smitten bodily into the air, and making a long arc in his descent, fell into the sea at a distance of about 50 yards. Not a chip of the boat was harmed, nor a hair of any oarsman's head, but the mate forever sank. It is well to parenthesize here that of the fatal accidents in the sperm whale fishery, this kind is perhaps almost as frequent as any. Sometimes nothing is injured but the man who is thus annihilated. Oftener, the boat's bow is knocked off, or the thigh-board in which the headman stands is torn from its place and accompanies the body. But strangest of all is the circumstance that in more instances than one, when the body has been recovered, not a single mark of violence is discernible, the man being stark dead. The whole calamity, with the falling form of Macy, was plainly described from the ship. Raising a piercing shriek, the vile, Gabriel called off the terror-stricken crew from the further hunting of the whale. This terrible event clothed the archangel with added influence, because his credulous disciples believed that he had specifically foreannounced it, instead of only making a general prophecy, which any one might have done, and so have chanced to hit one of the many marks in the wide margin allowed. He became a nameless terror to the ship. Mayhew, having concluded his narration, Ahab put such questions to him that the stranger captain could not forbear inquiring whether he intended to hunt the white whale if opportunity should offer, to which Ahab answered, "Aye." Straightway then, Gabriel once more started to his feet, glaring upon the old man, and vehemently exclaimed, with downward pointed finger, think of the blasphemer, dead and down there. Beware of the blasphemer's end."
Ahab solidly turned aside, then said to Mayhew, "Captain, I have just bethought me of my letter bag. There is a letter for one of thy officers, if I mistake not. Starbuck, look over the bag." Every whale ship takes out a goodly number of letters for various ships, whose delivery to the persons to whom they may be addressed depends upon the mere chance of encountering them in the four oceans. Thus most letters never reach their mark, and many are only received after attaining an age of 2 or 3 years or more. Soon Starbuck returned with a letter in his hand. It was sorely tumbled, damp, and covered with a dull, spotted green mold, in consequence of being kept in the dark locker of the cabin. Of such a letter, Death himself might well have been the postboy. "Canst not read it?" cried Ahab. "Give it me, man. Aye, it's but a dim scrawl. What's this?" As he was studying it out, Starbuck took a long cutting spade pole, and with his knife slightly spit the end, to insert the letter there, and in that way hand it to the boat without its coming any closer to the ship. Meantime, Ahab, holding the letter, muttered, "Mr. Har, yes, Mr. Harry, a woman's pinny hand, the man's wife, I'll wager. Aye, Mr. Harry Macy, ship Jeroboam. Why, it's Macy, and he's dead." Poor fellow, and from his wife," sighed Mayhew. "But let me have it." "Nay, keep it thyself," cried Gabriel to Ahab. "Thou art soon going that way." "Curses throttle thee," yelled Ahab. "Captain Mayhew, stand by now to receive it." And taking the fatal missive from Starbuck's hands, he caught it in the slit of the pole and reached it over towards the boat. But as he did so, the oarsmen expectantly desisted from rowing. The boat drifted a little towards the ship's stern, so that, as if by magic, the letter suddenly ranged along with Gabriel's eager hand. He clutched it in an instant, seized the boat knife, and impaling the letter on it, sent it thus loaded back into the ship. It fell at Ahab's feet. Then Gabriel shrieked out to his comrades to give way with their oars, and in that manner the mutinous boat rapidly shot away from the Pequod. As after this interlude, the seamen resumed their work upon the jacket of the whale, many strange things were hinted in reference to this wild affair. Chapter 72, The Monkey Rope. In the tumultuous business of cutting in and attending to a whale, there is much running backward and forwards among the crew. Now hands are wanted here, and then again hands are wanted there. There is no staying in any one place, for at one and the same time everything has to be done everywhere. It is much the same with him who endeavors the description of the scene. We must now retrace our way a little. It was mentioned that upon first breaking ground in the whale's back, the blubber hook was inserted into the original hole there cut by the spades of the mate. But how did so clumsy and weighty a mass as that same hook get fixed in that hole? It was inserted there by my particular friend Queequeg, whose duty it was, as harpooner, to descend upon the monster's back for the special purpose referred to. But in very many cases, circumstances require that the harpooner shall remain on the whale till the whole flensing or stripping operation is concluded. The whale, be it observed, lies almost entirely submerged, excepting the immediate parts operated upon. So down there, some 10 feet below the level of the deck, the poor harpooner flounders about, half on the whale and half in the water, as the vast mass revolves like a treadmill beneath him. On the occasion in question, Queequeg figured in the Highland costume, a shirt and socks, in which, to my eyes at least, he appeared to uncommon advantage, and no one had a better chance to observe him, as will presently be seen. Being the savage's bowsman, that is, the person who pulled the bow oar in his boat, the second one from forward, it was my cheerful duty to attend upon him while taking that hard scramble upon the dead whale's back. You have seen Italian organ boys holding a dancing ape by a long cord. Just so, from the ship's steep side, did I hold Queequeg down there in the sea by what is technically called in the fishery a monkey rope, attached to a strong strip of canvas belted round his waist. It was a humorously perilous business for both of us. For before we proceed further, it must be said that the monkey rope was fast at both ends, fast to Queequeg's broad canvas belt, and fast to my narrow leather one, so that for better or for worse, we too, for the time, were wedded. And should poor Queequeg sink to rise no more, then both usage and honor demanded that instead of cutting the cord, it should drag me down in his wake. So then an elongated Siamese ligature united us. Queequeg was my own inseparable twin brother, nor could I anyway get rid of the dangerous liabilities which the hempen bond entailed. So strongly and metaphysically did I conceive of my situation then, that while earnestly watching his motions, I seemed distinctly to perceive that my own individuality was now merged in a joint stock company of two, and that my free will had received a mortal wound, and that another's mistake or misfortune might plunge innocent me into unmerited disaster and death. Therefore, I saw that here was a sort of interregnum in Providence, for its even-handed equity never could have sanctioned so gross an injustice. And yet still further pondering, while I jerked him now and then from between the whale and the ship, which would threaten to jam him, still further pondering, I say, I saw that this situation of mine was the precise situation of every mortal that breathes. Only in most cases, he, one way or another, has this Siamese connection with a plurality of other mortals. If your banker breaks, you snap. If your apothecary by mistake sends you poison in your pills, you die. True, you may say that by exceeding caution you may possibly escape these and the multitudinous other evil chances of life. But handle Queequeg's monkey rope heedfully as I would. Sometimes he jerked it so that I came very near sliding overboard. Nor could I possibly forget that, do what I would, I only had the management of one end of it. I have hinted that I would often jerk poor Queequeg from between the whale and the ship, where he would occasionally fall from the incessant rolling and swaying of both. But this was not the only jamming jeopardy he was exposed to. Unappalled by the massacre made upon them during the night, the sharks now freshly and more keenly allured by the before-pent blood which began to flow from the carcass, the rabid creatures swarmed round it like bees in a beehive. And right in among those sharks was Queequeg, who often pushed them aside with his floundering feet, a thing altogether incredible were it not that, attracted by such prey as a dead whale, the otherwise miscellaneously carnivorous shark would seldom touch a man. Nevertheless, it may well be believed that since they have such a ravenous finger in the pie, it is deemed but wise to look sharp to them. Accordingly, besides the monkey rope with which I now and then jerked the poor fellow from too close a vicinity to the maw of what seemed a peculiarly ferocious shark, he was provided with still another protection. Suspended over the side in one of the stages, Tashtego and Dagu continually flourished over his head a couple of keen whale spades, wherewith they slaughtered as many sharks as they could reach. This procedure of theirs, to be sure, was very disinterested and benevolent of them. They meant Queequeg's best happiness, I admit, but in their hasty zeal to befriend them, and from the circumstance that both he and the sharks were at times half hidden by the blood-muddled water, those indiscreet spades of theirs would come nearer amputating a leg than a tail. But poor Queequeg, I suppose, straining and gasping there with that great iron hook. Poor Queequeg, I suppose, only prayed to his Yojo, and gave up his life into the hands of his gods. Well, well, my dear comrade and twin brother, thought I, as I drew in and then slacked off the rope to every swell of the sea. What matters it, after all? Are you not the precious image of each and all of us men in this whaling world? That unsounded ocean you gasp in is life. Those sharks your foes, those spades your friends. And what between sharks and spades you are in a sad pickle and peril, poor lad. But courage, there is good cheer in store for you, Queequeg. For now, as with blue lips and bloodshot eyes, the exhausted savage at last climbs up the chains and stands all dripping and involuntarily trembling over the side, the steward advances, and with a benevolent, consolatory glance hands him, what, some hot cognac? No, hands him, ye gods, hands him a cup of tepid ginger and water. Ginger! Do I smell ginger? Suspiciously asked Stubb, coming near. Yes, this must be ginger, peering into the as yet untasted cup. Then standing, as if incredulous for a while, he calmly walked towards the astonished steward, slowly saying, Ginger, ginger, and will you have the goodness to tell me, Mr. Doughboy, where lies the virtue of ginger? Ginger, is ginger the sort of fuel you use, Doughboy, to kindle a fire in this shivering cannibal? Ginger, what the devil is ginger? Sea coal, firewood, lucifer matches, tinder, gunpowder. What the devil is ginger, I say, that you offer this cup to our poor Queequeg here? There is some sneaking temperance society movement about this business, he suddenly added, now approaching Starbuck, who had just come from forward. Will you look at that cannikin, sir? Smell of it, if you please. Then watching the mate's countenance, he added, the steward, Mr. Starbuck, had the face to offer that calomel and jalap to Queequeg there, this instant off the whale. Is the steward an apothecary, sir? And may I ask whether this is the sort of bitters by which he blows back the life into a half-drowned man?
Trust not, said Starbuck. It is poor stuff enough. Aye, aye, stewards, cried Stubb. We'll teach you to drug a harpooner. None of your apothecary's medicine here. You want to poison us, do ye? You've got out your insurance on our lives and want to murder us all and pocket the proceeds, do ye? It was not me, cried Doughboy. It was Aunt Charity that brought the ginger on board and bade me never give the harpooners any spirits, but only this ginger jub, so she called it. Ginger jub, you gingerly rascal. Take that and run along with you to the lockers and get something better. I hope I do no wrong, Mr. Starbuck. It's a captain's orders, grog for the harpooner on a whale. Enough, replied Starbuck. Only don't hit him again, but, oh, I never hurt when I hit, except when I hit a whale or something of that sort. And this fellow's a weasel. What were you about saying, sir? Only this, go down with him and get what thou wantest thyself. When Stubb reappeared, he came in with a dark flask in one hand and a sort of tea caddy in the other. The first contained strong spirits and was handed to Queequeg. The second was Aunt Charity's gift, and that was freely given to the waves. Chapter 73, Stubb and Flask kill a right whale, and then have a talk over him. It must be borne in mind that all this time we have a sperm whale's prodigious head hanging to the Pequod's side, but we must let it continue hanging there for a while till we can get a chance to attend to it. For the present, other matters press, and the best we can do for the head is to pray heaven tackle us may hold. Now, during the past night and forenoon, the Pequod had gradually drifted into a sea, which, its occasional patches of yellow brit, gave unusual tokens of the vicinity of right whales, a species of the Leviathan that but few supposed to be at this particular time lurking anywhere near. And though all hands commonly disdained the capture of these inferior creatures, and though the Pequod was not commissioned to cruise for them at all, and though she had passed numbers of them near the Crozets without lowering a boat, yet now what a sperm whale had been brought alongside and beheaded. To the surprise of all, the announcement was made that a right whale should be captured that day if opportunity offered. Nor was this long wanting. All spouts were seen to leeward, and 2 boats, Stubbs and Flasks, were detached in pursuit. Pulling further and further away, they at last became almost invisible to the men at the mastheads. But suddenly in the distance they saw a great heap of tumultuous white water, and soon after news came from aloft that one or both of the boats must be fast. An interval passed, and the boats were in plain sight, in the act of being dragged right towards the ship by the towing whale. So close did the monster come to the hull that at first it seemed as if he meant it malice, but suddenly going down in a maelstrom within 3 rods of the planks, he wholly disappeared from view, as if diving under the keel. Cut, cut, was a cry from the ship to the boats, which for one instant seemed on the point of being brought with a deadly dash against the vessel's side. But having plenty of line yet in the tubs and the whale not sounding very rapidly, they paid out abundance of rope, and at the same time pulled with all their might so as to get ahead of the ship. For a few minutes the struggle was intensely critical, for while they still slacked out the tightened line in one direction and still plied their oars in another, the contending strain threatened to take them under. It was only a few feet advance they sought to gain, and they stuck to it till they did gain it, when instantly a swift tremor was felt running like lightning along the keel, as a strained line, scraping beneath the ship, suddenly rose to view under her bows, snapping and quivering, and so flinging off its drippings that the drops felt like bits of broken glass on the water, while the whale beyond also rose to sight, and once more the boats were free to fly. But the fagged whale abated his speed, and blindly altering his course, went round the stern of the ship, towing the 2 boats after him, so they performed a complete circuit. Meantime, they hauled more and more upon their lines, till close flanking him on both sides, Stubb answered Flask with lance for lance, and thus round and round the Pequod the battle went, while the multitude of sharks that had been swum around the sperm whale's body rushed to the fresh blood that was spilled, thirstily drinking at every gash, as the eager Israelites did at the new bursting fountains that poured from the smitten rock. At last his spout grew thick, and with a fruitful roll and vomit, he turned upon his back a corpse. While the 2 headsmen were engaged in making fast cords to his flukes, and in other ways getting the mass in readiness for towing, some conversations ensued between them. I wonder what the old man wants with this lump of foul lard, said Stubb, not without some disgust as the thought of having to do so ignoble a leviathan. Wants with it, said Flask, pulling some spare line in the boat's bow. Did you never hear that the ship, which but once has a sperm whale's head hoisted on her starboard side, and at the same time a right whale's on the larboard, did you never hear, Stubb, that ship can never afterwards capsize? Why not? I don't know, but I heard that gamboged ghost of a Fedallah saying so, and he seems to know all about ship's charms, but I sometimes thinks he'll charm the ship to no good at last. I don't like half that chap, Stubb. Did you ever notice how that tusk of his is a sort of carved into a snake's head, Stubb? Sink him. I never look at him at all. But if I ever get a chance of a dark night and he's standing hard by the bulwarks and no one by, look down there, Flask, pointing into the sea with a peculiar motion of both hands. Aye, will I. Flask, I take that Fedallah to be the devil in disguise. You believe that cock and bull story about his having been stowed away on a board ship? He's the devil, I say. The reason why we don't see his tail is because he tucks it up out of sight. He carries it coiled away in his pocket, I guess. Blast him, now that I think of it, he's always wanting oakum to stuff into the toes of his boots. He sleeps in his boots, don't he? He hasn't got any hammock, but I've seen him lay of night in a coil of rigging. No doubt, and it's because of his cursed tail who coils it down, do you see, in the eye of the rigging. What's the old man have so much to do with him for? Striping up a swap or a bargain, I suppose. Bargain? About what? Why, do you see, the old man is hard bent after that white whale, and the devil there is trying to come round him and get him to swap away his silver watch for his soul or something of that sort, and then he'll surrender Moby-Dick. Pooh, Stubb, you're skylarking. How can Fedallah do that? I don't know, Flask, but the devil is a curious chap and a wicked one, I tell ye. Why, they'd say as how he went sauntering in the old flagship once, swishing his tail about devilish easy and the gentleman-like, and inquiring if the old governor was at home. Well, he was home and asked the devil what he wanted. The devil, switching his hoops up and saying, I want John. What for, says the old governor. What business is that of yours, said the devil, getting mad. I want to use him. Take him, says the governor. And by the Lord, Flask, if the devil didn't give John the Asiatic cholera before he got through with him, I'll eat this whale in one mouthful. But look sharp. Ain't you ready there? Well, then pull ahead and let's get the whale alongside. I think I remember some such story as you telling, said Flask, when at last the two boats were slowly advancing with their burden towards the ship. But I can't remember where. 3 Spaniards? Adventures of those 3 bloody-minded soldados? Did you read it there, Flask? I guess you did. No, never saw such a book. Heard of it, though. But now tell me, Stubb, do you suppose that devil you were speaking of just now, was that the same you say now is on board the Pequod? Am I the same man that helped kill this whale? Doesn't the devil live forever? Who ever heard that the devil was dead? Did you see any parson wearing mourning for the devil? And if the devil has a latch key to get into the admiral's cabin, don't you suppose he can crawl into a porthole? Tell me that, Mr. Flask. How old do you suppose Fedallah is, Stubb? You see that mainmast there pointing to the ship? Well, that's the figure one. Now take all the hoops on the Pequod's hold and string them along in a row with that mast for aughts. You see? Well, that would begin to be Fedallah's age, nor all the Coopers in creation couldn't show hoops enough to make aughts enough. But see here, Stubb, I thought you a little boasted just now that you meant to give Fedallah a sea toss if you get a good chance. Now, if he's so old as all these hoops of yours come to, and if he's going to live forever, what good will it do to pitch him overboard? Tell me that. Give him a good ducking anyhow. But he'll crawl back, duck him again, and keep ducking him. Suppose you could take it in his head to duck you, though. Yes, and drown you. What then? I should like to see him try it. I give him such a pair of black eyes he wouldn't dare to show his face in the admiral's cabin again for a long while, let alone down to the orlop there where he lives, and whereabouts on the upper decks where he sneaks. So much. Damn the devil, Flask. You suppose I'm afraid of the devil? Who's afraid of him except the old governor who dares catch him and puts him in a double darbies as he deserves? Well, lets him go kidnapping people, aye, and signed a bond with him. But all the people the devil kidnapped, he'd roast for him. There's the governor. Do you suppose Sabala wants to kidnap Captain Ahab? Do I suppose it? You'll know it before long, Flask. And I'm going now to keep a sharp lookout for him. If I see anything very suspicious going on, I'll just take him by the nape of his neck and say, look here, Beelzebub, you'll do it. And if he makes any fuss, by the Lord, I'll make a grab into his pocket for his tail, take it to the capstan, and give him such a wrenching and heaving that his tail will come short off at the stump. You see? And then I rather guess when he finds himself docked in that queer fashion, he'll sneak off without the poor satisfaction feeling his tail between his legs.
And what will you do with his tail, Stubb? Do with it? Sell it for an ox whip when we get home. What else? Now, do you mean what you say and have been saying all along, Stubb? Mean or not mean, here we are at the ship. The boats were hailed to tow the whale to the larboard side, where fluke chains and other necessities were already prepared for securing him. Didn't I tell you so? Said Flask. Yes, you'll soon see this right whale's head hoisted up on the opposite of that Parmacetti's. In good time, Flask's saying proved true. As before, the Pequod steeply leaned over toward the sperm whale's head. Now, by the counterpoise of both heads, she regained her even keel. Though sorely strange, you may well believe. So when on one side you hoist in Locke's head, you go over that way. But now, on the other side, hoist in Kant's, you can't come back again, but in very poor plight. Thus, some minds forever keeping trimming boat. Oh, ye foolish, throw in all these thunderheads overboard, and then you will float light and right. In disposing of the body of a right whale, when brought alongside the ship, the same preliminary proceedings commonly take place as in the case of the sperm whale, only in the latter instance, the head is cut off whole, but in the former, the lips and tongue are separately removed and hoisted on deck. with all the well-known black bone attached to what is called the crown piece. But nothing like this in the present case had been done. The carcasses of both whales had dropped astern, and the head-laden ship not a little resembled a mule carrying a pair of overburdened panniers. Meanwhile, Fedallah was calmly eyeing the right whale's head, and ever and anon glancing from the deep wrinkles there to the lines on his own hand. And Ahab chanced so to stand that the Parsee occupied his shadow. While if the Parsee's shadow was there at all, it seemed to him only to blend with it and lengthen Ahab's. As the crew toiled on, Laplandish speculations were bandied among them concerning all these passing things. Chapter 74, The Sperm Whale's Head, Contrasted View. Here now are two great whales lying their heads together. Let us join them and lay together our own. Of the grand order of folio leviathans, the sperm whale and the right whale are by far the most noteworthy. They're the only whales regularly hunted by man. To the Nantucketer, they present the two extremes of all known varieties of the whale. As the external difference between them is mainly observable in their heads, and as a head of each is the moment hanging from the Pequod side, and as we may freely go from one to the other by merely stepping across the deck, where I should like to know will you obtain a better chance to study practical cetology than here. In the first place, you're struck by the general contrast between these heads. Both are massive enough in all conscience, but there's certainly mathematical symmetry in the sperm whales, which the right whale sadly lacks. There's more character in the sperm whale's head. As you behold it, you involuntarily yield to the immense superiority to him in point of pervading dignity. In the present instance, too, this dignity is heightened by the pepper and salt color of his head at the summit, giving token of advanced age and large experience. In short, he is what the fishermen technically call a gray-headed whale. Let us now note what is least dissimilar in these heads, namely the two most important organs, the eye and the ear. Far back on the side of the head and low down near the angle of either whale's jaw. If you narrowly search, you will see the lashless eye, which you would fancy to be a young colt's eye, so out of all proportion it is to the head. Now, from this particular sideways position of the whale's eyes, it's plain that he can never see an object which is exactly ahead, no more than he can one exactly astern. In a word, the position of the whale's eyes corresponds to that of a man's ears, and you may fancy for yourself how it would fare you did you sideways survey objects through your ears. You'd find that you could only command some 30 degrees of vision in advance of the straight line of sight and about 30 more behind it. If your bitterest foe was walking straight toward you with a dagger lifted in broad day, you would not be able to see him any more than were he stealing upon you from behind. In a word, you'd have two backs, so to speak, but at the same time also two fronts, side fronts. For what is it that makes the front of a man? What indeed but his eyes? Moreover, while in most other animals that I can now think of, the eyes are so planted as imperceptibly to blend their visual power so as to produce one picture and not two to the brain. The particular position of the whale's eyes, effectually divided as they are by many cubic feet of solid head, which towers between them like a great mountain separating two lakes and valleys. This, of course, must wholly separate the impressions each independent organ imparts. The whale, therefore, must see one distinct picture on this side and another distinct picture on that side, while all in between must be profound darkness and nothingness to him. Man may, in effect, be said to look out on the world from a sentry box with two joined sashes for his windows. But with the whale, these two sashes are separately inserted, making two distinct windows, but sadly impairing the view. This peculiarity of the whale's eyes is a thing always to be borne in mind in the fishery, and to be remembered by the reader in some subsequent scenes. A curious and most puzzling question might be started concerning this visual matter as touching the Leviathan, but I must content with a hint. So long as a man's eyes are open in the light, the act of seeing is involuntary. That is, he cannot help mechanically seeing whatever objects are before him. Nevertheless, anyone's experience will teach him that though he can take in an indiscriminating sweep of things in one glance, it is quite impossible for him attentively and completely to examine any two things, however large or however small, at one and at the same instant of time. Never mind if they lie side by side and touch each other. But if you now come to separate these two objects and surround each by a circle of profound darkness, then, in order to see one of them in such a manner as to bring your mind to bear on it, the other must be utterly excluded from your contemporary consciousness. How is it then with the whale? True, both his eyes in themselves must simultaneously act, but his brain, so much more comprehensive, combining and subtle than a man's, that he can at the same time attentively examine two distinct prospects, one on one side of him and the other in exactly the opposite direction? If he can, then it's a marvelous thing in him, as if a man were able to simultaneously go through the demonstrations of two distinct problems in Euclid. Nor, strictly investigated, is there any incongruity in this comparison. It may be but an idle whim. It has always seemed to me that the extraordinary vacillations of movement displayed by some whales when beset by 3 or 4 boats, the timidity and liability to queer frights so common to such whales, I think that all this indirectly proceeds from the helpless perplexity of volition, in which their divided and diametrically opposite powers of vision must involve them. But at the ear of the whale is full as curious as the eye. If you are an active stranger to their race, you might hunt over these two heads for hours and never discover that organ. The ear has no external leaf whatever, and into the hole itself you can hardly insert a quill, so wondrously minute it is. It is lodged a little behind the eye. With respect to the ears, this important difference is to be observed between the sperm whale and the right. While the ear of the former has an external opening, that of the latter is entirely and evenly covered with a membrane, so as to be quite imperceptible from without. Is it not curious that so vast a being as the whale should see the world through so small an eye, and hear the thunder through an ear that is smaller than a hare's? But if his eyes were broad as the lens of Herschel's great telescope, and his ears capacious as the porches of cathedrals, would that not make him any longer of sight or sharper of hearing? Not at all. Why then do you try to enlarge your mind, subtleize it? Let us now, with whatever levers and steam engines we have at hand, cant over the sperm whale's head, so that we may lie bottom up. Then, ascending by a ladder to the summit, we have a peep down the mouth. And were it not that the body is now completely separated from it, with a lantern we might descend into the great Kentucky mammoth cave of its stomach. But let us hold on here by his tooth, and look about us where we are. What a really beautiful and chaste-looking mouth, from the floor to ceiling lined, or rather papered, with a glistening white membrane, glossy as bridal satins.
But come out now and look at this portentous lower jaw, which seems like the long, narrow lid of the immense snuff box, with the hinge at one end instead of one at one side. If you pry it up so as to get it overhead and expose its rows of teeth, it seems a terrific portcullis, and such, alas, it proves to many a poor right of the fishery, upon whom these spikes fall with impaling force. But far more terrible is it to behold what fathoms down in the sea you see some sulky whale floating there suspended, with his prodigious jaw, some 15 feet long, hanging straight down at right angles, with his body for all the world like a ship's jib boom. This whale is not dead. He is only dispirited, out of sorts, perhaps, hypochondriac, and so supine that the hinges of his jaw have relaxed, leaving him there in that ungainly sort of plight, a reproach of his tribe, who must, no doubt, lock jaws upon him. In most cases, this lower jaw, being easily unhinged by a practiced artist, is disengaged and hoisted on deck for the purpose of extracting the ivory teeth. and furnishing a supply of that hard white whalebone with which the fishermen fashion all sorts of curious articles, including canes, umbrella stalks, and handles to riding whips. With a long, weary hoist, the jaw is dragged on board as if it were an anchor, and when the proper time comes, some few days after the other work, Queequeg, Dago, and Tashtigo will all accomplished dentists are set to drawing teeth. With a keen cutting spade, Queequeg lances the gums, then the jaw is lashed down to ring bolts, and a tackle being rigged from aloft, they drag out these teeth. As Michigan oxen drag stumps of old oaks out of the wild woodlands. There are generally 42 teeth in all, in old whales much worn down, but undecayed, nor filled after artificial fashion. The jaw is afterwards sawn into slabs and piled away like joists for building houses. Chapter 75, The Right Whale's Head. Crossing the deck, let us now have a good long look at the right whale's head. As in general shape, the noble whale's head may be compared to a Roman war chariot, especially in front, where it is so broadly rounded. So at a broad view, the right whale's head bears a rather inelegant resemblance to a gigantic galliot-toed shoe. 200 years ago, an old Dutch voyager likened its shape to that of a shoemaker's last, and in the same last, or shoe, that old woman with the nursery tale, with a swarming brood, might have comfortably been lodged, she and all of her progeny. But as you come nearer to this great head, it begins to assume different aspects, according to your point of view. If you stand on its summit and look into these two F-shaped spout holes, you would take the whole head for an enormous bass violin, and these spectacles the apparatus of the sounding board. Then again, if you fix your eye upon this strange crested comb-like incrustation on top of this mass, this green barnacled thing, which the Greenlanders call the crown, and the southern fishers the bonner of the right whale, fixing your eye solely on this, you would take the head for the trunk of some large, huge oak with a bird's nest in its crotch. At any rate, when you watch these live crabs that nestle here on this bonnet, such an idea will be almost sure to occur to you, unless indeed your fancy has been fixed by the technical term crown, also bestowed upon it, in which case you will take great interest in thinking how this mighty monster is actually a diaderned king of the sea, whose green crown has been put together for him in this marvelous manner. But if this whale be a king, he is very sulky looking fellow to grace a diadem. Look at that hanging lower lip, with a huge sulk and pout is there, a sulk and a pout by carpenter's measurement, some 25 feet long and 5 feet deep. A sulk and a pout that will yield you to some 500 gallons of oil or more. A great pity now that the unfortunate whale should be pear-lipped, the fissure around about a foot across. Probably the mother, during the important interval, was sailing down the Peruvian coast when earthquakes caused the beach to gape. Over this lip, as over a slippery threshold, we now slide into the mouth. Upon my word, were I Mackinaw, I should take this and be inside of an Indian wigwam. Good Lord, is this the road that Jonah went? The roof is about 12 feet high and runs a pretty sharp angle, as if there were a regular ridgepole there, while these ribbed arches, hairy sides, present us with these wondrous half-vertical scimitar-shaped slats of whalebone, say 300 on a side, which, depending from the upper part of the head or the crown bone, form these Venetian blinds from which have everywhere been curiously mentioned. The edges of these bones are fringed with hairy fibers, through which the right whale strains the water and in whose intricates he retains the small fish. When open-mouthed, he goes through the seas of grit in feeding time, and the central blinds of bone, as they stand in their natural order, there are certain curious marks, curves, hollows, and ridges, whereby some whalemen calculate the creature's age, as the age of an old oak by its circular rings. Through the certainty of this criterion is far from demonstrable, yet it has been savor of an analogical probability. At any rate, if we yield to it, we must grant a far greater age to the right whale than at first glance will seem reasonable. In old times, there seem to have been prevailed the most curious fancies concerning these blinds. One voyager in Purchas calls them the wondrous whiskers inside the whale's mouth, another hog's bristles. A third old gentleman in Hackey's uses the following eloquent language. There are about 250 fins growing on each side of his upper chop, which arch over his tongue on each side of his mouth. As everyone knows, these same hog bristles and fins, whiskers, blinds, or whatever you please, furnish to the ladies their busts and other stiffening contrivances, but in this particular, the demand has been on the decline. It was in Queen Anne's time that the bone was in its glory, the farthingale being then all of the fashion, and as those ancient dames moved about gaily through in the jaws of the whale, as you may say, even so in a shower with like thoughtfulness. Do we nowadays fly under the same jaws for protection, the umbrella being a tent spread over the same bone? But now forget all about blinds and whiskers for a moment, and standing in the right whale's mouth, look around you afresh, seeing all these colonnades of bone so methodically ranged about. Would you not think you were inside of the great harem organ and gazing upon its thousand pipes? For a carpet to the organ, we have a rug of the softest Turkey, the tongue, which is glued as it were to the floor of the mouth. It is very fat and tender, and apt to tear into pieces in hoisting it on deck. This particular tongue now before us, at a passing glance, I should say, it was a barreler, that is, it will yield you about that amount of oil.
Ere this, you must have plainly seen the truth of what I started with, that the sperm whale and the right whale have almost entirely different heads. To sum up then, in the right whales, there is no great well of sperm, no ivory teeth at all, no long, slender mandible of the lower jaw, like the sperm whales. Nor in the sperm whale are there any of those blinds of bone, no huge lower lip, and scarcely anything of the tongue. Again, the right whale has two external spout holes, the sperm whale only one. Look your last now on these venerable hooded heads, while they yet lie together, for one will soon sink, unrecorded in the sea, the other will not very long in the following. Can you catch the expression of the sperm whale's there? It is the same he died with, only some of the longer wrinkles in the forehead seem now faded away. I think his broad brow to be full of a prairie-like placidity, born of the speculative indifferences to death. But mark the other's head's expression. See that amazing lower lip, pressed by accident against the vessel's side, so as firmly to embrace the jaw. Does not this whole head seem to speak of an enormous practical resolution in facing death? This right whale I take to have been a Stoic, sperm whale a Platonian, who might have taken up Spinoza in his later years. Chapter 76, The Battering Ram. Ere quitting for the nonce, the sperm whale's head, I would have you, as a sensible physiologist, simply, particularly remark its front aspect in all its compacted collectness. I would have you investigate it now with the sole view of forming to yourself some unexaggerated, intelligent estimate of whatever battering ram power may be lodged there. Here is a vital point, for you must either satisfactorily settle this matter with yourself, or forever remain an infidel as to one of the most appalling, but not the less true events, perhaps anywhere to be found in all recorded history. You observe that in the ordinary swimming position of the sperm whale, the front of his head presents an almost wholly vertical plane to the water. You observe that the lower part of that front slopes considerably backwards, so as to furnish more of a retreat for the long socket which receives the boom-like lower jaw. You observe that the mouth is entirely under the head, much in the same way, indeed, as though your own mouth were entirely under your chin. Moreover, you observe that the whale has no external nose, and that what nose he has, his spout hole, is on the top of his head. You observe that his eyes and ears are at the sides of his head, nearly 1/3 of his entire length from the front. Wherefore, you must now have perceived that the front of the sperm whale's head is a dead blind wall, without a single organ, or tender prominence of any sort whatsoever. Furthermore, you are now to consider that only in the extreme lower backward sloping part of the front of the head is there the slightest vestige of bone. Not till you get near 20 feet from the forehead do you come to the full cranial development, so that this whole enormous boneless mass is as one wall. Finally, though, as will soon be revealed, its contents partly comprise the most delicate oil. Yet you are now to be apprised of the nature of the substance which so impregnably invests all that apparent effeminacy. In some previous place I have described to you how the blubber wraps the body of the whale, as the rind wraps an orange. Just so with the head, but with this difference. About the head, this envelope, though not so thick, is of a bony toughness, inestimable by any man who has not handled it. The severest pointed harpoon, the sharpest lance darted by the strongest human arm, impotently rebounds from it. It is as though the forehead of the sperm whale were paved with horses' hoofs. Do not think that any sensation lurks in it. Bethink yourself also of another thing. When two large loaded India men chance to crowd and crush towards each other in the docks, what do the sailors do? Do not suspend between them, at the point of coming contact, any merely hard substance like iron or wood. No, they hold there a large round wad of tow and cork, enveloped in the thickest and toughest of oxhide. That bravely and uninjured takes the jam which would have snapped all their oaken handspikes and iron crowbars. By itself, this sufficiently illustrates the obvious fact I drive at. But supplementary to this, it has hypothetically occurred to me that as ordinary fish possess what is called a swimming bladder in them, capable at will of distension or contraction, and as the sperm whale, as far as I know, has no such provision in him, considering, too, the otherwise inexplicable manner in which he now depresses his head altogether beneath the surface, and anon swims with it high elevated out of the water, considering the unobstructed elasticity of its envelope, considering the unique interior of his head, it has hypothetically occurred to me, I say, that those mystical lung-celled honeycombs there may possibly have some hitherto unknown and unsuspected connection with the outer air, so as to be susceptible to atmospheric distension and contraction. If this be so, fancy the irresistibleness of that might, to which the most impalpable and destructive of all elements contribute. Now mark, unerringly impelling this dead, impregnable, uninjurable wall, this most buoyant thing within, there swims behind it all a mass of tremendous life, only to be adequately estimated as piled wood is by the cord, and all obedient to one volition as the smallest insect. So that when I shall hereafter detail to you all the specialties and concentrations of potency everywhere lurking in this expansive monster, when I shall show you some of his more inconsiderable brainy feats, I trust you will have renounced all ignorant incredulity and be ready to abide by this, that though the that though the sperm whale stove a passage through the Isthmus of Darien and mixed the Atlantic with the Pacific, you would not elevate one hair of your eyebrow. For unless you own the whale, you are but a provincial and sentimentalist in truth. Clear truth is a thing for salamander giants only to encounter. How small the chances for the provincials then? What befell the weakling youth lifting the dread goddess's veil of Laius? Chapter 77, the Great Heidelberg Tun. Now comes the veiling of the case. But to comprehend it aright, you must know something of the curious internal structure of a thing operated upon. Regarding the sperm whale's head as a solid oblong, you may, on an inclined plane, sideways, divide it into two points, where the lower is the bony structure forming the cranium and jaws, and the upper an unctuous mass wholly free from bones, its broad forward end forming the expanded vertical apparent forehead of the whale. At the middle of the forehead, horizontally subdivide this upper plane, and then you have two almost equal parts, which before were naturally divided by an internal wall of a thick tendinous substance. The lower subdivided part, called the junk, is one immense honeycomb of oil formed by the crossing and recrossing into 10,000 infiltrated cells of tough, elastic white fibers through its whole extent. The upper part, known as the case, may be regarded as the great Heidelberg Tun of the sperm whale. As that famous great tears is mystically carved in front, so the whale's vast plated forehead forms innumerable strange devices for the emblematical adornment of his wondrous tun. Moreover, as that of Heidelberg was always replenished with the most excellent of the wines of the Rhenish valleys, so the tun of the whale contains by far the most precious of all his oily vintages, namely the highly prized spermaceti, in its absolutely pure, limpid, and odoriferous state. Nor is this precious substance found unalloyed in any other part of the creature. Though in life it remains perfectly fluid, yet upon exposure to the air after death, it soon begins to concrete, sending forth beautiful crystalline sheaths, as when the first thin, delicate ice is just forming in water. The large whale's case generally yields about 500 gallons of sperm, though from unavoidable circumstances, considerable of it is spilled, leaks, dribbles away, or is otherwise irrevocably lost in the ticklish business of securing what you can.
I know not with what fine and costly material the Heidelberg was coated within, but in superlative richness, that coating could not possibly have compared with the silken, pearl-colored membrane, like the lining of a fine pelisse, forming the inner surface of the sperm whale's case. It will have been seen that the Heidelberg tun of the sperm whale embraces the entire length of the entire top of the head, and since, as has been elsewhere set forth, the head embraces 1/3 of the whole length of the creature, then letting the length down at 80 feet for a good-sized whale. You have more than 26 feet for the depth of the tun, when it is lengthwise hoisted up and down against a ship's side. As in decapitating the whale, the operating instrument is brought close to the spot where an entrance is subsequently forced in the spermaceti magazine. He has, therefore, to be uncommonly heedful, lest a careless and timely stroke should invade the sanctuary and wastingly let out its invariable contents. It is this decapitated end of the head, also, which is at last elevated out of the water and retained in that position by the enormous cutting tackles, whose hempen combinations on one side make quite a wilderness of ropes in that quarter. Thus much being said, attend now, I pray you, to that marvelous, and in this particular instance, almost fatal operation whereby the sperm whale's great Heidelberg tun is tapped. Chapter 78, Cistern and Buckets. Nimble as a cat, Testigo mounts aloft, and without altering his erect posture, went straight out among the overhanging made yard arm, to the part where it exactly projects over the hoisted tug. He has carried with him a light tackle called a whip, consisting of only two parts, traveling through a single sheaved block. Securing this block so it hangs down from the yard arm, he swings one end of the rope till it is caught and firmly held by a hand on deck. Then hand over hand down the other part, the Indian drops through the air till dexterously he lands on the summit of the head. There, still high elevated above the rest of the company, to whom he vivaciously cries, he seems some Turkish muezzin calling the good people to prayers from the top of the tower. A short-handled sharp spade being sent up to him, he diligently searches for the proper place to begin breaking into the tongue. In this business he proceeds very heedfully, like a treasure hunter in some old house, sounding the walls to find where the gold is masoned in. By the time this cautious search is over, a stout iron-bound bucket, precisely like a well bucket, has been attached to one end of the whip, while the other end, being stretched across the deck, is there held by 2 or 3 alert hands. Their last now host the bucket within grasp of the Indian, whom another person has reached up a very long pole. Inserting this pole into the bucket, Tashtigo downward guides the bucket into the tongue till it entirely disappears. Then giving the word to the seaman at the whip, up comes the bucket again, all bubbling like a dairymaid's pail of new milk. Carefully lowered from its height, the full freighted vessel is caught by an appointed hand and quickly emptied into a large tub. Then remounting aloft, it again goes through the same round until the deep cistern will yield no more. Toward the end, Tashtigo has to ram his long pole harder and harder and deeper into the tongue until some 20 feet of the pole have gone down. Now the people of the Pequot have been bailing some time in this way. Several tubs have been filled with the fragrant sperm, when all at once a queer accident happened. Whether it was that Tashtigo, that wild Indian, was so heedless and reckless as to let go for a moment his one-handed hold on the great cable tackle suspending the head, or whether the place where it stood was so treacherous and oozy, or whether the evil one himself would have it to fall out so, without starting his particular reasons. How it was exactly, there is no telling now, but on a sudden, as the 18th or 19th bucket came suckingly up, my God, poor Tashtigo, like the twin reciprocating bucket in a veritable well, dropped head foremost down into this great ton of Heidelberg, and with a horrible oily gurgling, went clean out of sight. Man overboard, said Dagu, who amid the general consternation first came to his senses. Swing the bucket this way, and putting one foot into it, so as the better to secure his slippery handhold on the whip itself. The hoisters ran him high up to the top of the head, almost before Tashtigo could have reached its interior bottom. Meantime, there was a terrible tumult. Looking over the side, they saw the before lifeless head, throbbing and heaving just below the surface of the sea, as if that moment seized with some momentous idea, whereas it was the only poor Indian unconsciously revealing by those struggles the perilous depth to which he had sunk. At this instant, while Dagu on the summit of the head was clearing the whip, which had somehow got foul of the great cutting tackles, a sharp crackling noise was heard, and to the unspeakable horror of all, one of the 2 enormous hooks suspending the head tore out, and with a vast vibration, the enormous mass sideways swung, till the drunk ship reeled and shook as if smitten by an iceberg. The one remaining hook, upon which the entire strain now depended, seemed every instant to be in the point of giving way, an event still more likely than the violent motions of the head. come down, yelled the seaman to Daggoo, and with one hand holding on to the heavy tackles, so that if the head should drop, he would still remain suspended. The Negro, having cleared the foul line, rammed down the bucket into the now collapsed well, meaning that the buried harpooner should grasp it and so be hoisted out. In heaven's name, man, cried Stubb, are you ramming home a cartridge there? Avast! How will that help him? Jamming that iron-bound bucket on top of his head. Avast, will ye? Stand clear of the tackle, cried a voice like the bursting of a rocket. Almost in the same instant, with a thunder boom, the enormous mass dropped into the sea, like Niagara's Table Rock into the whirlpool. The suddenly relieved hull rolled away from it, too far down for glittering copper, and all caught their breath as, half swinging, now over the sailor's head and now over the water, Daggoo, through a thick mist of spray, was dimly beheld clinging to the pendulous tackles, while poor buried alive Tashtigo was sinking utterly down to the bottom of the sea. But hardly had the blinding vapor cleared away, when a naked figure with the boarding sword in his hand was for one swift moment seen hovering above the bulwarks. The next, a loud splash announced that my brave Queequeg had dived to the rescue. One packed rush was made to the side, and every eye counted every ripple, as moment followed moment, and no sign of either the sinker or the diver could be seen. Some hands now jumped into the boat alongside and pushed a little off from the ship. Ha ha, cried Daggoo, all at once from his now quiet swinging perch overhead. And looking further off from the side, we saw an arm thrust upright from the blue waves, a sight strange to see, as an arm thrust forth from the grass over a grave. Both, it is both, cried Daggoo again with a joyous shout. And soon after, Queequeg was seen boldly striking out with one hand, and with the other clutching the long hair of the Indian. Drawn into the waiting boat, they were quickly brought to the deck. But Tashtigo was long in coming to, and Queequeg did not look very brisk. Now, had this noble rescue been accomplished, why, diving after the slowly descending head, Queequeg with his keen sword had made side lunges near its bottom, so as to scuttle a large hole there. Then, dropping his sword, has thrust his long arm far inwards and upwards, and so hauled out poor Tash by the head. He averred that upon first thrusting in for him, a leg was presented, but well knowing that was not as it ought to be, and might occasion great trouble, he had thrust back the leg, and by a dexterous heave and toss had wrought a somerset upon the Indian, so that with the next trial he came forth in a good old way, head foremost. And as for the head itself, that was doing as well as one could be expected.
And thus, through the courage and great skill in obstetrics of Queequeg, the deliverance, or rather delivery of Tashtigo was successfully accomplished, in the teeth, too, of the most untoward and apparently hopeless impediments, which is a lesson by no means to be forgotten. Midwifery should be taught in the same course with fencing and boxing, riding and rowing. I know that this queer adventure of the gay-headers will be sure to seem incredible to some landsmen, though they themselves may have either seen or heard of someone's falling into a cistern ashore, an accident which not seldom happens, and with much less reason, too, than the Indians, considering the exceeding slipperiness of the curb of the sperm whale's well. But peradventure, it may be sagaciously urged, how is this? We thought the tissued, infiltrated head of the sperm whale was the lightest and most corky part about him, and yet thou makest it sink in an element of a far greater specific gravity than itself? We have thee there. Not at all, but I have ye. for at the time poor Tash fell in, the case had been nearly emptied of its lighter contents, leaving little but the dense, tendinous wall of the well, a double-welded, hammered substance, as I have said before, much heavier than the seawater, and a lump of which sinks in it like lead almost. But the tendency to rapid sinking in this substance was in the present instance materially counteracted by the other parts of the head remaining undetached from it, so that it sank very slowly and deliberately indeed, offering Queequeg a fair chance for performing his agile obstetrics on the run, as you may say. Yes, it was a running delivery, so it was. Now, had Tashtego perished in that head, it had been a very precious perishing, smothered in the very whitest, daintiest, fragrant spermaceti, coffined, pursed, entombed by the secret inner chamber and sanctum sanctorum of the whale. Only one sweeter end can readily be recalled: the delicious death of an Ohio honey hunter who, seeking honey in the crotch of a hollow tree, found such exceeding store of it that, leaning too far over, it sucked him in, so that he died embalmed. How many, think ye, have likewise fallen into Plato's honey head and sweetly perished there? Chapter 79, the Prayer. To scan the lines of his face, feel the bumps on the head of this Leviathan, this is a thing which no physiognomist or phrenologist has yet undertaken. Such an enterprise would seem almost as hopeful as for Lavater to have scrutinized the wrinkles on the rock of Gibraltar, or Gaul to have mounted a ladder and manipulated the dome of the Pantheon. Still, in that famous work of his, Lavater not only treats of the various faces of men, but also attentively studies the faces of horses, birds, serpents, and fish, and dwells in detail on the modifications of expression discernible therein. Nor have Gall and his disciple Spurzheim failed to throw out some hints touching the phrenological characteristics of other beings than man. Therefore, though I am but ill qualified for a pioneer in the application of these two semi-sciences to the whale, I will do my endeavor. I try all things. I achieve what I can. Physiognomically regarded, the sperm whale is an anomalous creature. He has no proper nose. And since the nose is the central and most conspicuous of the features, and since it is perhaps most modifies and finally controls their combined expressions, hence it would seem that in its entire absence as an external appendage must very largely affect the countenance of the whale. For as in landscape gardening, a spire, cupola, monument, or tower of some sort is deemed almost indispensable to the completion of the scene, so no face can be physiognomically in keeping without the elevated open-work belfry of the nose. Dash the nose from Phidias's Marble Job, and what do we have? A sorry reminder. Nevertheless, Leviathan is of so mighty a magnitude, all his proportions are so stately, that the same deficiency which in the sculptured Jove was hideous, in him is no blemish at all. Nay, it is an added grandeur. A nose to the whale would have been impertinent. As on your physiognomical voyage you sail round his vast head in your jolly boat, your noble conceptions of him are never insulted by the reflection that he has no nose, or nose to be pulled. A pestilent conceit, which so often will insist upon obtruding even when beholding the mightiest royal beetle on his throne. In some particulars, perhaps the most imposing physiognomical view to be had of the sperm whale is that of the full front of his head. This aspect is sublime. In a thought, a fine human brow is like the east when troubled with the morning. In the repose of the pasture, the curled brow of the bull has a touch of the grand in it. Pushing heavy cannon up mountain defiles, the elephant's brow is majestic. Human or animal, the mystical brow is as that great golden seal affixed by the German emperors to their decrees. It signifies God, done this day by my hand. But in most creatures, nay, in man himself, very often the brow is just the mere strip of alpine land lying along the snow line. Few are the foreheads which, like Shakespeare's or Melanchthon's, rise so high and descend so low that the eyes themselves seem clear, eternal, tideless mountain lakes, and all above them in the forehead's wrinkles you seem to track the antlered thoughts descending there to drink, as the Highland hunters track the snow prints of the deer. But in the great sperm whale, this high and mighty godlike dignity inherent in the brow is so immensely amplified that gazing on it in that full front view, you feel the deity and the dread powers more forcibly than in beholding any other object in living nature. For you see, no one point precisely, not one distinct feature is revealed. No nose, eyes, ears, or mouth, no face. He has none. Proper, nothing but that one broad firmament of a forehead, pleated with riddles, dumbly lowering with the doom of boats and ships and men. Nor in profile does this wondrous brow diminish, though that way viewed its grandeur does not domineer upon you so. In profile, you plainly perceive that horizontal, semi-crescentic depression in the forehead's middle, which in man is Lavater's mark of genius.
可是这怎么说得通呢？我乡经中有天才，我乡经有没有写过一本书，发表过一篇演说？没有。他的伟大的天才在于不去做任何特别的事来证明自己是天才，更有甚者，他以金字塔式的沉默来宣告自己是天才。而这令我想到，如果年轻的东方世界知道有大抹香鲸这一物的话，他在这个世界的天真我教徒的思想中会被作为神明奉祀。他们把尼罗河中的鳄鱼奉若神明，因为鳄鱼没有舌头，我相鲸也没有舌头，至于是它的舌头极小，小的生不出来。如果此后有任何一个有高度文化教养、富有诗意的民族能引得古代武术节诸神回来赢得他们的继承权，使他们重登那座如今已是无人光顾的山上，那个如今已是利己主义者的天堂中的宝座，那么毫无疑问，伟大的抹香鲸将被抬至朱比特大神的高位，将君临一切。Champollion deciphered the wrinkled granite hieroglyphics, but there is no Champollion to decipher the Egypt or of every man's and every being's face. Physiognomy, like every other human science, is but a passing fable. If then Sir William Jones, who read in 30 languages, cannot read the simplest peasant's face in its profounder and more subtle meanings, how may unlettered Ishmael hope to read the awful Chaldee of the sperm whale's brow? I but put that brow before you. Read it if you can. Chapter 80. If the sperm whale be physiognomically a sphinx to the phrenologist, his brain seems that geometrical circle which it is impossible to square. In the full-grown creature, the skull will measure at least 20 feet in length. Unhinge the lower jaw, and the side view of the skull is as the side view of a moderately inclined plane resting throughout on a level base. But in life, as we have elsewhere seen, this inclined plane is angularly filled up and almost squared by the enormous superincumbent mass of the junk and sperm. At the high end, the skull forms a crater to bed that part of the mass, while under the long floor of this crater, in another cavity seldom exceeding 10 inches in length and as many in depth, reposes the mere handful of this monster's brain. The brain is at least 20 feet from his apparent forehead in life. It is hidden away behind his vast outworks, like the innermost citadel within the amplified fortifications of Creekback. So, like Choi's casket, is it secreted in him that I have known some whalemen who peremptorily deny that the sperm whale has any other brain than that palpable semblance of one formed by the cubic yards of a sperm magazine. Lying in strange folds, courses, and convolutions of his sperm, to their apprehensions, it seems more in keeping with the idea of his general mind to regard the mystic part of him as the seat of his intelligence. It is plain, then, that phrenologically, the head of this Leviathan, in this creature's living intact state, is an entire delusion. As for his true brain, you can then see no indications of it, nor feel any. The whale, like all things, they are mighty, wears a false brow to the common world. If you unfold the skull of its spermy heaps, and then take a rear view of its rear end, which is a high end, you will be struck by its resemblance to the human skull, beholding the same situation and from the same point of view. Indeed, place this reversed skull scale down to the human magnitude among a plate of men's skulls, and you would involuntarily confound it with them, and remarking the depressions on one part of its summit. In phrenological phrase, you would say, this man I had no self-esteem and no veneration. And by those negations, considered along with the affirmative fact of its prodigious bulk and power, it can best form to herself the truest, though not the most exhilarating conception of what the most exalted potency is. But if from the comparative dimensions of the whale's proper brain, you deem it incapable of being adequately charted, then I have another idea for you. If you attentively regard almost any quadruped spine, you will be struck with the resemblance of its vertebra to a strong necklace of dwarfed skulls, all bearing rudimental resemblance to the skull proper. It is a German conceit that the vertebrae are absolutely undeveloped skulls. But the curious external resemblance, I take it, the Germans were not the first man to perceive. A foreign friend once pointed out to me, in the skeleton of a foe he has slain, and with the vertebra of which he was inlaying, in a sort of basso relievo, the beaked prow of his canoe. Now I consider that the phrenologists have omitted an important thing in not pushing their investigations from the cerebellum through the spinal canal. For I believe that much of a man's character will be found betokened in his backbone. I would rather feel your spine than your skull, whoever you are. A thin joist of a spine never yet upheld a full and noble soul. I rejoice in my spine, and in the firm, audacious staff of the flag which I fling half out to the world. Apply the spinal branch of phrenology to the sperm whale. His cranial cavity is continuous with the first neck vertebra. And in that vertebra, the bottom of the spinal canal will measure 10 inches across, in 8 in 8, and of a triangular figure with a base downwards. As it passes through the remaining vertebra, the canal tapers in size, but for a considerable distance remains of large capacity. Now, of course, this canal is filled with much the same strangely fibrous substance, the spinal cord, as a brain, and directly communicates with the brain. And what is still more, for many feet after emerging from the brain's cavity, the spinal cord remains of an undecreasing girth, almost equal to that of the brain. Under all these circumstances, would it be unreasonable to survey and map out the whale spine phrenologically? Nor, for viewed in this light, the wonderful comparative smallness of his brain proper is more than compensated by the wonderful comparative magnitude of his spinal cord. But leaving this hang to operate as it may with the phrenologists, I would merely assume the spinal theory for a moment. In reference to the sperm whale's hump, this august hump, if I mistake not, rises over one of the larger vertebrae, and is therefore, in some sort, the outer convex mood of it, from its relative situation then. I should call this high hump the organ of firmness or indomitableness in the sperm whale, and that the great monster is indomitable. You will yet have reason to know.
Chapter 81. The Pequod Meets the Virgin. The predestinated day arrived, and we duly met this ship, Jungfrau, Derek de Deer, master of Bremen. At one time, the greatest whaling people in the world, the Dutch and the Germans, are now among the least. But here and there, at very wide intervals of latitude and longitude, you still occasionally meet with their flag in the Pacific. For some reason, the Jungfrau seemed quite eager to pay her respects. While yet some distance from the Pequod, she rounded to, and dropping a boat, her captain was impelled towards us, impatiently standing in the bow instead of the stern. "What has he in his hand there?" cried Starbuck, pointing to something wavingly held by the German. "Impossible. A lamp feeder." "Not that," said Stubb. No, it's a coffee pot. Mr. Starbuck, he's coming off to make us our coffee." "Is the yarman. Don't you see that big tin can there alongside of him? That's his boiling water. Oh, he's all right," is the yarman. "Go along with you," cried Flask. "It's a lamp feeder in an oil can. He's out of oil and he's come a-begging." However curious it may seem for an oil ship to be borrowing oil on the whale ground, and however much it may inadvertently contradict the old proverb about carrying coals to Newcastle, yet sometimes such a thing really happens, and in the present case, Captain Derek de Deer did indubitably conduct a lamp feeder, as Flask did declare. As he mounted the deck, Ahab abruptly accosted him, without at all heeding what he had in his hand. But in his broken lingo, the German soon evinced his complete ignorance of the white whale, immediately turning the conversation to his lamp feeder and oil can, with some remarks touching his having to turn into his hammock at night in profound darkness, his last drop of Bremen oil being gone, and not a single flying fish yet captured to supply the deficiency. Concluding by hinting that his ship was indeed what in the fishery is technically called a clean one, That is, an empty one, well deserving the name of Jungfrau, or the Virgin. His necessities supplied, Derek departed, but he had not gained his ship's side when whales were almost simultaneously raised from the mastheads of both vessels. And so eager for the chase was Derek that without pausing to put his oil camp and lamp feeder aboard, he slewed round his boat and made after the Leviathan lamp feeders. Now the game having risen to leeward, he and the other 3 German boats that soon followed him had considerably the start of the Pequod's keels. There were 8 whales, an average pod. Aware of their danger, they were going all abreast with great speed straight before the wind, rubbing their flanks as closely as so many spans of horses in harness. They left a great wide wake, as though continually unrolling a wide parchment upon the sea. Full in this rapid wake, and many fathoms in the rear, swam a humped old bull, which by his comparatively slow progress, as well as by the unusual yellowish incrustations overgrowing him, seemed afflicted by the jaundice or some other infirmity. Whether this whale belonged to the pod in advance seemed questionable, for it was not customary for such venerable leviathans to be at all social. Nevertheless, he stuck to their wake, though indeed their backwater must have retarded him, because the white bone or swell at his broad muzzle was a dashed one, like the swell formed when 2 hostile currents meet. His spout was short, slow, and laborious, coming forth with a choking sort of gush and spending itself in torn shreds, followed by a strange subterranean commotions in him, which seemed to have egress at his other buried extremity, causing the waters behind him to upbubble. "Who's got some paregoric?" said Stubb. "He has the stomach ache, I'm afraid. Lord, thinking of having half an acre of stomach ache. Adverse winds are holding mad Christmas in him, boys. It's the first foul wind I ever knew to blow from astern, but look, did ever whale yaw so before? It must be he's lost his tiller." As an overladen Indiaman, bearing down the Hindustan coast with a deckload of frightened horses, careens, buries, rolls, and wallows on her way, so did this old whale heave his aged bulk, and now and then, partly turning over on his cumbrous rib ends, expose the cause of his devious wake in the unnatural stump of his starboard fin. Whether he had lost that fin in battle, or had been born without it were hard to say. "Only wait a bit, old chap, and I'll give ye a sling for that wounded arm," cried cruel Flask, pointing to the whale line near him. "Mind he don't sling thee with it," cried Starbuck. "Give way, or the German will have him." With one intent, all the combined rival boats were pointed for this one fish, because not only was he the largest and therefore the most valuable whale, but he was the nearest to them. And other whales were going with such great velocity, moreover, as almost to defy pursuit for the time. At this juncture, the Pequod's keel had shot by the 3 German boats last lowered, but from the great start he had had, Derek's boats still led the chase, though every moment neared by his foreign rivals. The only thing they feared was that from being already so nigh to his mark, he would be enabled to dart his iron before they could completely overtake and pass him. As for Derek, he seemed quite confident that this would be the case, and occasionally, with the deriding gesture, shook his lamp feeder at the other boats. "The ungracious and ungrateful dog," cried Starbuck. "He mocks and dares me with the very poor box I filled for him not 5 minutes ago." Then in his old intense whisper, "Give way, greyhounds. Dog to it." "I tell ye what it is, men," cried Stubb to his crew. "It's against my religion to get mad. but I'd like to eat that villainous yarman. Pull, won't ye? Are ye going to let the rascal beat ye? Do ye love brandy? A hogshead of brandy then to the best man. Come, why don't some of ye burst a blood vessel? Who's that been dropping an anchor overboard? We don't budge an inch, we're becalmed, halloo. He's grass growing in the boat's bottom, and by the Lord, the mast there's budding. This won't do, boys. Look at that yarman. The short and long of it is, men, will ye spit fire or not? Oh, see the suds he makes, cried Flask, dancing up and down. What a hump! Oh, do pile on the beef. Lays like a log. Oh, my lads, do spring slapjacks and quahogs for supper. You know, my lads, baked clams and muffins. Oh, do spring. He's 100-barreler. Don't lose him now. Don't, oh, don't see that yarman. Oh, won't ye pull for your duff, my lad? Such a sogger. Don't he love sperm? There goes $3,000, man. A bank, a whole bank, the Bank of England. Oh, do. What's that yarman about now? At this moment, Derek was in the act of pitching his lamp feeder at the advancing boats and his oil can, perhaps with the double view of retarding his rival's way, and at the same time economically accelerating his own by the momentary impetus of the backward toss. The unmannerly Dutch dogger, cried Stubb. Pull now, men, like 50,000 line of battle ships of red-haired devils. What do you say, Tashtego? Are you the man to snap your spine in 2 and 20 pieces for the honor of the old gayhead? What do you say? I say pull like goddamn, cried the Indian, fiercely but evenly incited by the taunts of the Germans. The Pequod's 3 boats now began ranging almost abreast, and so disposed, momentarily neared them. In that fine, loose, chivalrous attitude of the headsman when drawing near to his prey, the 3 mates stood up proudly, occasionally backing after oarsmen with an exhilarating cry of, there she slides now, hurrah for the white ash breeze, down with the yarman, sail over him. But so decided an original start had Derek had, that spite of all their gallantry, he would have proved the victor in this race, had not a righteous judgment descended upon him in a crab which caught the blade of his midship oarsman. While this clumsy lubber was striving to free his white ash, and while in consequence Derek's boat was nigh to capsizing, and he thundering away at his men in a mighty rage, that was a good time for Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask. With a shout, they took a mortal start forwards and slantingly raged up on the German's quarter. An instant more, and all 4 boats were diagonically in the whale's immediate wake, while stretching from them on both sides was the foaming swell that he made.
It was a terrific, most pitiable and maddening sight. The whale was now going head out and sending his spout before him in a continual tormented jet, while his one poor fin beat his side in an agony of fright. Now to this hand, now to that, he yawed in his faltering flight, and at every billow that he broke, he spasmodically sank in the sea, or sideways rolled toward the sky, his one beating fin. So have I seen a bird with clipped wing, making affrighted broken circles in the air, vainly striving to escape the piratical hawks. But the bird has a voice, and with plaintive cries will make known her fear. But the fear of this vast, dumb brute of the sea was chained up and enchanted in him. He had no voice, save that choking respiration through his spiracle, and this made the sight of him unspeakably pitiable, while still, in his amazing bulk, portcullis jull, and omnipotent tail, there was enough to appall the stoutest man who so pitied. Seeing now that but a very few moments more would give the Pequod the Pequod boats the advantage, and rather than thus be foiled of his game, Derek chose to hazard what to him must have seemed a most unusually long dart, ere the last chance would forever escape. But no sooner did his harpooner stand up for the stroke than all three tigers, Queequeg, Tashtigo, Daggoo, instinctively sprang to their feet and, standing in a diagonal row, simultaneously pointed their barbs and darted over the head of the German harpooner. Their three Nantucket irons entered the whale, blinding vapors of foam and white fire. The three boats, in the first fury of the whale's headlong rush, bumped the Germans aside, and with such force that both Derek and his baffled harpooner were spilled off and sailed over by the three flying keels. "Don't be afraid, my butter boxes," cried Stubb, casting a passing glance upon them as he shot by. "You'll be picked up presently, all right. Saw some sharks astern. St. Bernard's dogs, you know, relieve distressed travelers. Hurrah! This is the way to sail now. Every keel a sunbeam. Hurrah! Here we go like three tin kettles at the tail of a mad cougar. This puts me in mind of fastening to an elephant in a tilbury on a plain. Makes the wheel spokes fly, boys, when you fasten to 'em that way. And there's danger of being pitched out, too, when you strike a hill. Hurrah! This is the way a fellow feels when he's going to Davy Jones, all a rush down an endless inclined plane. Hurrah! This wheel carries the everlasting mail." But the monster's run was a brief one. Giving a sudden gasp, he tumultuously sounded. With a grating rush, the three lines flew round the loggerheads with such a force as to gouge deep grooves in them, while so fearful were the harpooneers that this rapid sounding would soon exhaust the lines, that using all their dexterous might, they caught repeated smoking turns with a rope to hold on, till at last, owing to the perpendicular strain from the lead-lined chocks of the boats, whence the three ropes went straight down into the blue. The gunwales of the bows were almost even with the water, while the three sterns tilted high up in the air. And the whales soon ceasing to sound, for some time they remained in that attitude, fearful of expending more line, though the position was a little ticklish. But though boats have been taken down and lost in this way, yet it is this holding on, as it is called, this hooking up by the sharp barbs of his live flesh from the back. This it is that often torments the Leviathan into soon rising again to meet the sharp lance of his foes. Yet, not to speak of the peril of the thing, it is to be doubted whether this course is always the best. For it is but reasonable to presume that the longer the stricken whale stays underwater, the more he is exhausted, because owing to the enormous surface of him, in a full-grown sperm whale, something less than 2,000 square feet, the pressure of water is immense. We all know what an astonishing atmospheric weight we ourselves stand up under, even here above ground in the air. How vast then the burden of a whale, bearing on his back a column of 200 fathoms of ocean. It must at least equal the weight of 50 atmospheres. One whaleman has estimated it at the weight of 25 line of battle ships, with all their guns and stores and men on board. As the three boats lay there gently on that gently rolling sea, gazing down in its eternal blue noon, and as not a single groan or cry of any sort, nay, not so much as a ripple or a bubble came up from the depths, what landsman would have thought that beneath all that silence and placidity, the utmost monster of the sea was writhing and wrenching in agony? Not 8 inches of perpendicular rope were visible at the bows. Seems it credible that by 3 such thin threads, the great Leviathan was suspended, like the big weight to an 8-day clock. Suspended? And to what? To 3 bits aboard. Is this the creature of whom it was so once triumphantly said, "Canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears? The sword of him that layeth at him cannot hold, the spear, the doubt, nor the habergeon. He esteemeth iron as straw. The arrow cannot make him flee. Darts are counted as stubble. He laugheth at the shaking of a spear." This the creature? This he? Oh, that unfulfillment should follow the prophets. For with the strength of 1,000 thighs in his tail, Leviathan had run his head under the mountains of the sea to hide him from the Pequod's fish spears. In that sloping afternoon sunlight, the shadows that the 3 boats sent down beneath the surface must have been long enough and broad enough to shade half Xerxes' army. Who can tell how appalling to the wounded whale must have been such huge phantoms flitting over his head? "Stand by, men, he stirs," cried Starbucks as the 3 lines suddenly vibrated in the water, directly conducting upwards to them as if by magnetic wires the life and death throbs of the whale, so that every oarsman felt them in his seat. The next moment, relived in great part from the downward strain at the bows, the boats gave a sudden bounce upwards, as a small ice field will when a dense herd of white bears are scared from it into the sea. Haul in, cried Starbuck, he's rising. The lines of which hardly an instant below, not 1 hand's breadth could have been gained, were now in long, quick coils flung back, all dripping into the boats, and soon the whale broke water within 2 ship lengths of the hunters. His motions plainly denoted his extreme exhaustion. In most land animals, there are certain valves or floodgates in many of their veins, whereby when wounded, the blood is in some degree, at least, instantly shut off in certain directions. Not so with the whale, one of whose peculiarities it is to have an entire non-valvular structure of the blood vessels, so that when pierced by even so small a point as a harpoon, a deadly drain is at once begun upon his whole arterial system. And when this is heightened by the extraordinary pressure of water at a great distance below the surface, his life may be said to pour from him in incessant streams. Yet so vast is the quantity of blood in him, and so distant and numerous its interior fountains, that he will keep thus bleeding and bleeding for a considerable period. Even as in a drought, a river will flow, whose source is the well springs of far off and undiscernible hills. Even now, when the boats pulled upon this whale and perilously drew over his swaying flukes, and the lances were darted into him, they were followed by steady jets from the new-made wound, which kept continually playing, while the natural spout hole in his head was only at intervals, however rapid, sending its affrighted moisture into the air. From this last vent, no blood yet came, because no vital part of him had yet been struck. His life, as they significantly call it, was untouched.
As the boats now more closely surrounded him, the whole upper part of his form, with much of it that is ordinarily submerged, was plainly revealed. His eyes, or rather the places where his eyes had been, were beheld. As strange mist-grown masses gather in the knotholes of the noblest oaks when prostrate,
So from the points which the whale's eyes had once occupied now protruded blind bulbs, horribly pitiable to see. But pity there was none. For all his old age and his one arm and his blind eye, he must die the death and be murdered in order to light the gay bridals and the other merrymakings of men, and also to illuminate the solemn churches that preach unconditional inoffensiveness by all to all. Still rolling in his blood, at last he partially disclosed a strangely discolored bunch or protuberance the size of a bushel low down on the flank. "A nice spot," cried Flask. "Just let me prick him there once." "Avast!" cried Starbuck. "There's no need of that." But humane Starbuck was too late. At the instant of the dart, an ulcerous jet shot from this cruel wound, and goaded by it into more than sufferable anguish, the whale, now spouting thick blood, with swift fury blindly darted at the craft, bespattering them and their glory and crews all over with showers of gore, capsizing Flask's boat and marring the bows. It was his death stroke. For by this time, so spent was he by loss of blood, that he helplessly rolled away from the wreck he had made, lay panting on his side, impotently flapped with his stumped fin, then over and over slowly revolved like a waning world, turned up the white secrets of his belly, lay like a log, and died. It was most piteous, that last expiring spout, as when by unseen hands the water is gradually drawn off some mighty fountain, and with half-stifled melancholy gurglings, the spray column lowers and lowers to the ground, so the last long-dying spout of the whale. Soon, while the crews were awaiting the arrival of the ship, the body showed symptoms of sinking with all its treasures unrifled. Immediately, by Starbuck's orders, lines were secured to it at different points, so that ere long every boat was a buoy, the sunken whale being suspended a few inches beneath them by the cords. By very heedful management, when the ship drew nigh, the whale was transferred to her side and was strongly secured there by the stiffest fluke chains, for it was plain that unless artificially upheld, the body would at once sink to the bottom. It so chanced that almost upon first cutting into him with the spade, the entire length of a corroded harpoon was found embedded in his flesh on the lower part of the bunch before described. But as the stumps of harpoons are frequently found in the dead bodies of captured whales, with the flesh perfectly healed around them, and no prominence of any kind to denote their place, therefore, there must needs have been some other unknown reason in the present case fully to account for the ulceration alluded to. But still more curious was the fact of a lance head of stone being found in him, not far from the buried iron, the flesh perfectly firm about it. Who had darted that stone lance, and when? It must have been doubted by some Norwest Indian long before America was discovered. What other marbles might have been rummaged out of this monstrous cabinet, there is no telling. But a sudden stop was put to further discoveries by the ships being unprecedentedly dragged over sideways to the sea, owing to the body's immensely increasing tendency to sink. However, Starbuck, who had the ordering of affairs, hung on to it to the last, hung on to it so resolutely, indeed, that when at length the ship would have been capsized, if still persisting in the locking arms with the body, then, when the command was given to break clear from it, such was the immovable strain upon the timber heads to which the fluke chains and cables were fastened, that it was impossible to cast them off. Meantime, everything in the Pequod was aslant. To cross to the other side of the deck was like walking up the steep, gabled roof of a house. The ship groaned and gasped. Many of the ivory inlayings of her bulwarks and cabins were started from their places by the unnatural dislocation. In vain, handspikes and crows were brought to bear upon the immovable fluke chains to pry them adrift from the timber heads, and so low had the whale now settled that the submerged ends could not be at all approached, while every moment whole tons of ponderosity seemed added to the sinking bulk, and the ship seemed on the point of going over. Hold on, won't ye? Cried Stubb to the body. Don't be in such a devil of a hurry to sink. By thunder, men, we must do something or go for it. No use prying there, avast. I say with your handspikes and run one of ye for a prayer book and a penknife and cut the big chains. Knife? Aye, aye, cried Queequeg, and seizing the carpenter's heavy hatchet, he leaned out of a porthole and steel to iron began slashing at the largest fluke chains. But a few strokes full of sparks were given when the exceeding strain affected the rest. With a terrific snap, every fastening went adrift. The ship righted, the carcass sank. Now, this occasional inevitable sinking of the recently killed sperm whale is a very curious thing. Nor has any fisherman yet adequately accounted for it. Usually the dead sperm whale floats with great buoyancy, with its side or belly considerably elevated above the surface. If the only whales that thus sank were old, meager, and broken-hearted creatures, their pads of lard diminished and all their bones heavy and rheumatic, then you might with some reason assert that this sinking is caused by an uncommon specific gravity in the fish so sinking, consequent upon this absence of buoyant matter in him. But it is not so. For young whales, in the highest health, and swelling with noble aspirations, prematurely cut off in the warm flush and May of life, with all their panting lard about them, even these brawny, buoyant heroes do sometimes sink. Be it said, however, that the sperm whale is far less liable to do this accident than any other species. When one of that sort goes down, 20 right whales do. This difference in the species is no doubt imputable in no small degree to the greater quantity of bone in the right whale. His Venetian blinds alone sometimes weighing more than a ton. From this encumbrance, the sperm whale is wholly free. But there are instances where, after the lapse of many hours or several days, the sunken whale rises again, more buoyant than in life. But the reason of this is obvious. Gases are generated in him. He swells to a prodigious magnitude, becomes a sort of animal balloon. A line of battleship could hardly keep him under then. In the shore whaling, on soundings among the bays of New Zealand, when a right whale gives token of sinking, they fasten buoys to him with plenty of rope, so that when the body has gone down, they know where to look for it when it shall have ascended again. It was not long after the sinking of the body that a cry was heard from the Pequod's mastheads, announcing that the Jungfrau was again lowering her boats, though the only spout in sight was that of a finback, belonging to the species of uncapturable whales because of its incredible power of swimming. Nevertheless, the finback spout is so similar to the sperm whales that by unskillful fishermen it is often mistaken for it. And consequently, Derrick and all his host were now in valiant chase of this unnearable brute. The Virgin crowding all sail made after her 4 young keels, and thus they all disappeared far to leeward, still in bold, hopeful chase. Oh, many are the finbacks and many are the derricks, my friend.